Hey, hi everyone. I think we can get started. So, Salma, if you want to share your screen, that'd be great. And then if anyone joins in the meeting room during the lecture, I'll just let them in. You're muted, by the way, so we can't hear you.
Sorry. Um, I just said hi. Today we're doing an intro to settler colonialism, and it's a pretty common critique. It's one of my favorite arguments to go for. And yeah, so the arguments that, or the table of contents, I'm already like in debate mode, but the table of contents is kind of like talking about what setcol is and a brief history of settler colonialism. It's just a historical overview of settler colonialism in America. It might seem kind of bland because it's just a bunch of history stuff, but I do think it's really important to know because these are the examples that you use in your speeches and cross, etc. Then parts of the critique, common answers, giving a 2 and R, and any concluding thoughts or questions anyone might have. So first is what is setcall? So setcall is a structuralist critique, and what that means is some people would argue that it is ontological. And yes, setcall does have ontology. You hear a lot like, oh, you didn't extend ontology right, or oh, the ontology portion of the setcall debate. I call it structuralist because it is inherently a structuralist theory. It is not necessarily ontology in the way that ontology is defined, but for debate purposes, we refer to it as like an ontologically justified critique. It is identity based. It is largely based off of, or largely or entirely based off of the experiences of Indigenous peoples. And as a result, a lot of people read Indigenous authors. And I would recommend reading Indigenous authors if you are reading a setcall critique. And it is also based off of assumptions and conclusions that the affirmative might have that you're responding to. I'm talking about this in a like in the perspective of reading this as like a K as part of your NC. And it's also really rooted in history, which is why we are going to get into history in a moment. So, what is settler colonialism? It's a K of typically one's representations, but it can also be like the affirmative link, like it can be links to the affirmative, don't necessarily have to be solely reps links, but again, we're going to get into that a little bit later. Setcall, like as it's constructed, can be simple and it could be one or two cards if you're just throwing it in and you're reading like seven off, or it could be the entire NC. So, like often the times, the claim that settler colonialism makes is something that the AF has done is bad for X reason. It typically perpetuates settler colonialism and it reifies X impact. And this impact could be so many things. A lot of times people just say like the historical erasure or genocide of the indigenous peoples. So this is a brief history. It's just an overview on useful info in on settler colonialism in the United States specifically. And trust me, this is really important. So I know this might seem weird because it's not super like I'm not talking about 2 and R's or like 1 AR responses, but it is really important to know like what you are talking about in terms of when you're asked questions, giving examples, etc. So the pre-colonial era before 1492, there was and when I say pre-colonial, I mean like before a bunch of white settlers came to the Americas and colonized and murdered indigenous people. So indigenous people were thriving. They had many societies, diverse languages, cultures, and religions. They had their own very complex setups already in the in the Americas. I'm not saying the United States yet because at this point in time, the United States didn't exist. In terms of governance, they had their own systems, they had their own governments, they had alliances and defense. So they literally had their own armies and stuff, and they had their own leadership positions. A lot of times, a stereotype is kind of like, oh, like the chiefs of tribes. It was a little bit different from tribe to tribe, but yeah, that is one. Population, this is an estimation, but there's probably between 50 to 100 million prior to European contact. That number has since decreased drastically, and we'll get into why. So early contact and quote exploration. The reason why I put exploration in quotes is because exploration just implies a kind of looking, not really taking, pillaging, etc. So Columbus never actually set foot on American soil, even though everyone's like, oh, he landed in the Americas in 1492. He landed on like some random island south of Florida. Like he never set foot on American soil. But this voyage initiated European exploration, like because when he went to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain for that money, They were skeptical, but then they gave it to him. And when other European nations saw that this was happening, they wanted to also get in the game. So it led to exploitation and conquest. So who else ended up colonizing the Americas? And this is going to be something that, if any of y'all have taken in American history class or are in AP US history, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and of course the English. So the first voyage was funded by the Spanish, though. In terms of diseases, diseases brought by Europeans wiped out a bunch of Native Americans. The disease that most famously wiped out everyone, like almost a very large amount of the population, I think, was smallpox. And this is kind of like there's this infamous stereotype of the quote smallpox blankets, in which when settlers figured out that indigenous people were getting sick because they didn't have the actual like resistance or the ability to resist diseases that they've never been exposed to, they would give them blankets that had been infected with smallpox or that had some exposure to smallpox, and they realized that that would eventually get them very sick and kill them. Jamestown and expansion, 1607 to the 1700s. Jamestown seems kind of random because it's like a singular settlement, but it is like the beginning of the end, basically. It's English established its first permanent colony in North America, and this was kind of when not only did England have like a foot in the door, but they were settled. They had a whole group of people settle in the Jamestown colony. And the early interactions were more revolving around trade because the settlers have yet to establish themselves. They're still building their homes, they're still building their societies. They don't necessarily have the facilities to, I would say, actually engage in warfare, and they were far outnumbered at this point. But eventually it would evolve into violent conflicts, as we see. So the Pilgrims and Puritans often settled in New England, and they displaced indigenous people. So, for example, the reason the words Chappaqua and La Crosse are up there is because the town that I live in is called Chappaqua. There is not a single indigenous family living in Chappaqua, despite the fact that the name of the town is indigenous, which implies that a lot of people were displaced here. So in the Northeast, a lot of towns have indigenous names. So like Peekskill, Poughkeepsie, these are all like towns in the Northeast that all have indigenous names and all have like a population of less than 0.5% indigenous people. So also when I say like lacrosse, like the Northeast, a very popular sport, lacrosse, we got that from indigenous peoples, and we often don't see like the actual impact. Like it's stuff that we've essentially poached and stolen indigenous culture. So eventually the colonies expanded, and forced seizures of land and broken treaties made indigenous influence decrease like significantly. And when the transatlantic slave trade began, enslaved Africans were brought to work on seized lands, which also made the white population wealthier and more powerful, able to buy things like weapons and things that could really harm indigenous peoples. And indigenous people's role in the transatlantic slave trade is multifaceted because a lot of wealthy indigenous people did in fact own slaves, but also some indigenous people were themselves enslaved. So it's kind of neither here nor there, but writ large, like indigenous people, the majority of them were most definitely oppressed and worse off by the transatlantic slave trade. The Proclamation Line of 1763, the reason this has its own slide is because it is really important. It established that despite the fact that America had sovereignty, there was no more moving. Settlers couldn't expand past this like imaginary line. And the imaginary line was in a territory called the Ohio River Valley, which is like, guess where? Ohio. And it would limit expansion to prevent conflict. Now, this was something that the British put in place to prevent settlers from continuing to move past that proclamation line because it was really starting to anger indigenous peoples. But settlers didn't really care because the British weren't really paying that much attention to them. The British kind of viewed settlers in the Americas as like separate, like not really British. They're just British settlers. So Britain focused all of their efforts on what was going on at home, not what was going on in the colonies, which is called salutary neglect. So after the proclamation line of 1763, the people just kind of like, and by the people, I mean the settlers, just kind of assumed that the British wouldn't do anything. So they ignored the government. The impact of this was that it increased conflict with indigenous peoples, and there were multiple like miniature battles between like settlers and indigenous tribes. They aren't really acknowledged as a resistance effort, and they are not brought up unless someone is talking about like the lead up to the American Revolution. These are all miniature wars, and I could have a 1 hour lecture on each of them. I really recommend you guys read into that. It is super interesting. American independence and westward expansion, 1776 to the 1820s. Independence, I put that in quotes because I personally think that the United States has no claim to this land, but the United States declared independence, which accelerated territorial expansion because they figured that they now had a right to continue expanding westward. And as for the Northwest Ordinance, that was a ordinance that was I believe, from 1787, and it encouraged settlements and marginalized indigenous sovereignty. So what that means is the Northwest Ordinance was basically this big go-ahead to a bunch of settlers that were like, yeah, like you can just keep expanding westward, even though we don't technically have a claim to that territory, but it's probably fine, was kind of the idea that that ordinance perpetuated. The impact of this was that there's more displacement, and it culminates in a series of events that we're about to talk about. So this act, I am not endorsing that you refer to indigenous peoples as Indian, but the act itself is called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So this was done by President Andrew Jackson, and it forced relocation of a bunch of indigenous peoples. And something that you should know is that in American history, Andrew Jackson is like propped up as this great American hero. Like he fought the War of 1812. He fought in like one of the most famous battles of the War of 1812. And that's what made him really famous because people felt like he was a true American. The issue with that is like whilst doing all of that, he was also actively murdering indigenous peoples and contributing to like their death and the decimation of tribes. So that brings me to the Trail of Tears. So the impact of the Indian Removal Act was the Trail of Tears because it was the process of forced relocation. So what this means is that indigenous peoples were essentially herded further westward. So like think of the areas of like Georgia, Louisiana, and they were kind of pushed even further out, eventually into the Midwest, and then further west into territories like Nevada, etc. But at the time, the United States didn't have a claim to that area yet, so they couldn't force them all there at that time. It was just it was just like a way to move further westward. So many people died. There were a lot of brutal conditions, even though there was this promise of peaceful relocation by the United States government to tribal leaders. And that obviously didn't happen. Lots of people got sick, died along the way. People were not given food. People were not given water, but they were at the mercy of United States soldiers who essentially formed these militias to escort them westward. And that would eventually culminate in their death. So the justifications were that settlers needed room for their agriculture and also something called manifest destiny, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about. Manifest destiny is an ideology that justified westward expansion as a divine right. Essentially, it was this idea that God had given the settlers, despite the fact that the country was founded on the basis of separation of church and state, it was an idea that God had given the settlers the divine right to expand westward. This land was theirs, or else they wouldn't have ended up here. So it allowed them to acquire a lot of territories because a lot of settlers were on board. So settlers that were skeptical of like, of things that were like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be hurting indigenous people or indigenous tribes. Maybe they're innocent. That was quickly shut down because of the justification of, oh, but God wants this, because a lot of people at the time were extremely religious. So this allowed them to acquire vast territories. And there were a lot of paintings and art that depict manifest destiny. For example, a really famous one is of a woman who looks like an angel dressed in Roman robes, and she's like pushing a militia of settlers forward and further westward. And it's a very famous image, and I'm sure a lot of y'all have seen it. So the reason I put treaties in quotes are because treaties are agreements, and these weren't really agreements. They were just lies that were fed to indigenous people so that they would think that they were having some sort of right. There was wars, treaties, purchases, the Louisiana Purchase, the annexation of Texas. Like when Louisiana was purchased, sorry, the British didn't purchase Louisiana. This was after the war, the Revolutionary War. So America was already a country and it's like an independent country in its own right. And so the Louisiana Purchase was something that allowed for like mass displacement of indigenous peoples because the United States bought Louisiana and now the indigenous peoples, but they didn't buy Louisiana from actual indigenous people. They bought it from other settlers, which is the issue because it allowed them to control indigenous people. So this culminated in a lot of displacement. Indigenous peoples faced a lot of displacement and massacres. The Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 is a massive one that I think is also a great example to go check out. Reservation system and assimilation policies. This is the late 19th century. Reservations essentially are just these little plots of land that are, quote, reserved for indigenous peoples to live on. And it's basically like settlers would give them these really crappy, slash do give them because reservations still exist, really crappy plots of land that are really difficult to grow things on and that are really almost unlivable. And there's often not even access to things like running water. And I'm talking about now, like in 2024. But anyways, so indigenous lands were divided into reservations through policies like the Dawes Act of 1887. And again, super interesting act. I would say very paternalizing in the sense that it said that if indigenous lands weren't divided into reservations, the indigenous people simply wouldn't know what to do with all of this land, as if they weren't already, living completely fine in very complex societies in the pre-colonial era, like we were discussing. So then the assimilation policy of the boarding schools was really, really problematic. Essentially, there were a bunch of boarding schools that decided to Americanize indigenous peoples. And what that means is that indigenous children were quite literally kidnapped from their families and forced into these boarding schools in which they were forced to speak English. They were not allowed to have their hair long. They were not allowed to wear indigenous clothing. They were not allowed to eat indigenous foods or whatever, like, or practice whatever religions that they practiced. And they were forced to convert to Christianity, speak English, all of that. So hair, clothing, language, practices, and religion, and this idea that when you Christianize someone, they suddenly become a civilized human being. So because indigenous people didn't wear English clothing, and because indigenous people did not speak the English language, because indigenous people were not Christian, they were not civilized. And this whole idea was perpetuated through this logic, or this ideology rather, of something called the white man's burden. So it was like, oh, well, these white people are so amazing for taking care and civilizing these indigenous people, was a really big narrative that the United States government perpetuated so that they would not look bad and they would look like saviors rather than people who are quite literally snatching babies from their mothers. And that would obviously be, very traumatic, especially for, the mothers, the families, not just the children that were taken. So resistance and revitalization, this is the last slide of the history segment. This is the 20th to the 21st century. Movements, so indigenous movements like I Don't Know More, American Indian movement has a lot of impacts in terms of sovereignty and civil rights right now. That happened also like during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. They used the civil rights movement to propel discourse about indigenous rights, even though a lot of people associate the civil rights movement with things like equality between Black and white people. It was also very much used as a way to advance narratives of indigenous sovereignty, which I think is really cool. And modern efforts, protests, and the reason why the word fracking is on here is because a lot of times when people plan to drill oil, like for example in Alaska, the Willow Project was this massive plan to drill a bunch of oil on indigenous lands that Biden said he was going to stop and then he approved it. They protested. So they kind of showed up to the site and tried not to allow them to do any work. It was really remarkable. And conservation efforts, i.e., even when indigenous people are delegated this little, like, very poor plot of land that is barely arable, they still try to conserve as much of that land and as much of the forest that is on that land as possible, which is really also interesting and impressive. So the third part is the parts of the critique. As you can see, I did not need a subtitle. Um, but the theory of power is the first part of the K. It explains indigenous relationships to settlers post-colonialism, i.e., there's always going to be this sort of weird dichotomy between the settler and the native. And this dichotomy is how settlers define themselves in relation to natives and use that narrative to suppress natives. So this can be a psychoanalytic claim or it can just be a structuralist claim. So Tuck and Yang make more of a structural claim, but Rifkin makes a pretty interesting psychoanalytic claim in which he talks about how no matter what, settlers always have this sort of death drive to indigenous peoples because they know that they cannot fully exist when indigenous peoples are at their full power. So they always have this drive to kill and eliminate as many indigenous peoples as possible to maintain that power. I think this argument is really interesting. I think Mark Rifkin is an excellent writer, and I think that a lot of people who are just dipping their toe into settler colonialism should definitely check this out. And settler colonialism overcodes for everyday actions and practices of individuals and the government is overall what every single claim of or theory of power kind of makes. Ontology claims, the reason why this is in quotes is because I just don't think it's truly an ontology claim. This is me being super nitpicky. You need to call it ontology within round or people are not going to understand what you're talking about. This is just me being really technical. It is not a static ontology claim. It means that we don't think that progress is impossible. Things can get better. And that is a good thing for things to be able to get better. We're not saying that progress is impossible, ontology is static, etc. We think a lot of good things can happen from, movements, from thinking, like we think progress is possible essentially. So when someone stands up and reads like 3 minutes of progress is possible, like you're like, yeah, we agree. We think it's possible through X mechanism, usually the alt. Ontology also explains how indigenous life is structured post-colonialism, and like I just talked about in the theory of power claim, the settler-native binary. Links. Okay, so topic link, you should always have a topic link. Even if you're hitting a philaf, always have a topic link. If you're hitting like, I guess a topical-ish KF, read a topic link. You should usually have an AF specific link. So for example, I'm going to use the example of like Kant. I can have a link to the topic because Kant has contention level offense, and I can also have a link to ideal theory being bad or Kant being racist, etc. A theory specific link, what I mean by theory specific link is like if they're reading some sort of framework mechanism, like for example, if they're reading util, you can have an extinction reps link and then a reps link in general, which is usually implicated by the framework interpretation. And it can sometimes be the framework interpretation itself. The specific evidence that I'm thinking of is the Henderson evidence, super popular. It's on my wiki and it's on several other very good debaters' wikis as well that I would be happy to share. The alternative, it should solve the links. You shouldn't read an alternative that can't overcome the links because if you choose to defend the alternative as as unconditional, sorry, you get yourself into a lot of trouble. Really common alternatives are decolonization, refusal, which refusal, in my opinion, is just like half of decolonization. Place-based education, there are infinite alternatives. I could list like 20. But when to kick the alt, oftentimes I would say kick the alt when you know the link turns case. Kick the alt when you are like running short on time and you know the link turns case. And I would say if there's like 10 dissats of the alt, like 10 perms, you didn't flow any of them, it's a good idea to kick it. But it's honestly personal preference because a lot of times some people always defend the alt as unconditional and go for it, and they're really good at that. But that should usually be drilled. The framework interpretation. If you ever have a policy judge in the back, and by policy judge, I don't mean like LD policy, like extinction outweighs, like disads, whatever. I mean like policy, as in policy debate judge. They love framework 2NRs. So essentially, a framework interpretation preempts the 1AR's like weigh the case claim, and it tells you what offense comes first. And it typically has theory standards. Like this comes first because of one, accessibility, two, and it is almost structured like a baby theory shell, even though that's not really what it is. It's usually one card with like two standards. And it talks about how the judge should think about the K, the 1 AR responses, etc. And policy judges love this as a 2 R if it is constructed correctly. So common answers to settler colonialism. Again, the subtitle thing did not need it, but ontology and theory of power answers. A lot of people say ontology is totalizing. When someone says this, they are literally exclusively talking about static ontology, almost always. And like we just discussed, this isn't a theory of static ontology, but we do agree that progress is probably possible. We do think that's a good thing, and we do think that Indigenous people should resist. This critique is not pessimistic. Specific pieces of evidence, the Lightfoot evidence, something that a lot of people love to read. A lot of people think this is a great card. And it would be a great card if Cheryl Lightfoot didn't change her mind. So there's another piece of Lightfoot evidence that says that talks about how Cheryl Lightfoot changed her mind. Really common. It's called the Cox 21 card, COX 21. And again, I'd be happy to share it. I think it's a great card. And it basically talks about how Lightfoot originally made a claim that says ideas of settler colonialism as unchanging or something that's always going to happen are incorrect. And Lightfoot changed her mind when Canada decided to pass several more fracking projects. The bus bridge evidence is like a veiled comparison to Marxism. It's not really about ontology, and it's very specifically about static ontology. But as for general answers to the cards, I'm like, I could go through a million preamps. These are just by far the most popular preamps and I guess answers in the 1 AR. And I would say that you need to understand your cards and your literature. Like, you absolutely need to understand it because there is absolutely no way you can be prepared or write out blocks to every single preempt and every single 1 AR answer. It is just not going to happen. So you really have to understand your ontology claim, what your author says, and doing that, I would recommend doing a lot of reading. But yeah. For the links, on the links, a lot of people say one, no link. I promise there is always a link and there is always room for link spin. Whether if it's a policy act, like there is always a link. So when people say no link, we do XYZ, you can leverage the warrants as to why it still links, etc. Link turns are very particular, and if you have or no links and link turns are very specific to the app. And if anyone has any specific questions about something that they hit, I'd be happy to answer it. The link turn, leverage the warrants on case and the card itself against the link turn. Do not drop the link turn because I promise this is going to be majority of the 2 AR. Extinction outweighs in a link turn versus a policy debater when you're reading set call. That is going to be the 2 AR. And it's a very good and persuasive 2 AR if the link turn is mishandled. The alternative, again, like I was talking about, like I was saying, oh no, there are 10 dissets of the alts and 7 perms. Kick. But if it is unconditional because you decided to make that decision, you can say, like, one, I promise there aren't 10 dissets of the alts. They all say the same thing in a different font. But two, the perms are usually easy to overcome and incorrect in the sense that like things like, oh, like perm do the af in the mindset of the alt or perm do the af then the K, like all of these things have like literal one-line answers that are so simple. Like perm do the af in the mindset of the alt, what do you mean mindset? Like we're like, oh, we feel really bad about doing all of these bad things to Indigenous peoples, but we're still going to do them anyways. But we still feel bad. We're in the mindset of decolonization. Like there's these little things in which the permutations sound big and scary because you and I are both aware that they're offensive arguments, but they aren't great offensive arguments. Also, classic thing to say, links are disads to the perm. If someone concedes a link, you could be like, the link functions as a massive disad to the perm. Explain why. Oftentimes, this needs to start in the NC. I think this argument is kind of fake, but a lot of judges like it. And so links or disads to the perm can be in the NC, and I don't think it hurts. Continued, alt fails. One, you should have carded answers explaining why the alternative does not fail. Two, you can have analytic answers that explain why the alternative does not fail because you should just be understanding your literature and understanding your alternative. And the explanation of why the alt solves the links has to be something that should be drilled before the tournament. And I just think it's a generally good practice to get in the habit of drilling like the 2 Rs that you think you're going to give before tournaments. On the framework interpretation. So they're going to have an alternative framework interpretation. It's always going to be a copy and pasted block that is in the one area that's like, oh, like AF gets away the case, like clash, fairness, whatever. You need to flow it if you want to answer the framework interpretation and extend yours as offense. And if they don't have a framework interpretation, they've low-key given you the ballot because you've already explained what offense comes first. You have given them two offensive standards and offensive reasons as to why, like, settler colonial epistemology is the most important thing within this round. And it's a pretty important thing when you're leveraging, when you're like up layering things like extinction and up layering things that the app has said. Answer their standards. That's what I just said. You can say can't weigh the case, or you could go for like when you say can't weigh the case, that shouldn't be it. You should say they can't weigh the case. But even if they are winning that they can weigh the case, the link still turns the case. The link functions as a case turn or an offensive reason as to why, even if they can weigh the case, they still lose. So lastly, we're going to talk about giving a 2-NR. And in my opinion, this is the superior, even though it's a subjective order of a set equal 2-NR. I truly think that this way is probably the most organized way to give a settler colonialism 2-NR. But again, I'm extremely biased. And also, if some judges are very picky and they're like, please go in the order of the 1AR. So take this with a grain of salt. So ontology, the extension of ontology claims needs to come first, and then a line by line of their responses. You need to understand each part of ontology. Like, for example, if you understand the structural claim that ontology is making, but you don't understand that it's not like this static theory of pessimism that thinks that, that does like thinks that progress is possible, whatever, whatever. Like, if you don't understand all of those moving pieces, you are going to lose the ontology debate. And a lot of times the ontology debate determines who wins or loses the round. I cannot tell you how many times I've been in like just a regular Sec v policy debate and ontology has just been dropped. Ontology is offense. Extend it and treat it as offense. In terms of the framework, and when I say framework, I'm talking about your framework interpretation. Standards from the NC, you should extend them. And usually, like all of the stuff that's like, oh, util or extinction outweighs stuff, that should be done here when you're talking about like the standards from the NC, what comes first, when judges are like, there's several very common arguments here, like, oh, like you as a non-Indigenous judge are biased, and that's proven by our standards of like XYZ. Like very, it's kind of a nuanced 2-NR to give, but I would say that framework is not worth scoffing at. You definitely want answers to weigh the case. You want ink on why extinction reps are good, etc. The link proper, you pick the link that you're extending. It's a link extension and an explanation of how it implicates, turns, and outweighs case. And then a line by line of the 1AR responses to the link. If you've read like 4 links and they've answered 2 links, go for the links that they dropped. I know that some people get very attached to certain links because giving us certain 2-NRs are fun when you're comfortable with it or when you maybe have it scripted or all of that. But give a 2-NR to the link that they dropped because 1, you should be understanding every link you read, and 2, it's more strategic and it makes the judge want to vote for you because they dropped an entire link. They dropped offense. They don't have a link turn. They don't have like a no link argument. They have nothing on it. So, again, me with my correct order. I think the alternative should come next. It's an extension of the alt and an explanation of how it solves the links. You have to explain why it's separate from the AF before you explain the permutations, because this is an overview that is almost priming the judge to reject the permutation. Now, all you have to say after this is reject the permutation like a sentence, and the judge already kind of like is liking the order of why that's is liking the order in which you are doing things. And what can the app not do that the alternative can do? This does not mean like floating pick. I've gotten a couple of questions about that in the past. No, this is not like necessarily a floating pick. This is just like the app can't solve for this or can't explain indigenous relationships to X, but the alt can. Line by line of their answers to the alt. And then that's where you do the perms and the disats. And when I say disats, I just mean disats to the alt or answers to like answers like alt fails, etc. So answer the permutations. Again, the links are disats to the perm. I really just don't understand why people say this. I don't think it's warranted. I think it's a singular blip, but a lot of judges do like it. And then disats to the alt, you have to answer. Case, I think you should always be extending a little bit of case. Extend defense at the very least. Like, if you're like, oh, I don't feel great about the ontology debate, and I feel like I might be losing extinction outweighs, like, extend defense to the case, extend reasons as to why not doing the app doesn't like result in extinction. Because if they're winning, oh, extinction reps are good, that's not a reason to vote AF. They have to win that they actually prevent extinction. So I think that you should most definitely always be extending case unless you have like completely run out of time. And if you have completely run out of time and you have no like link turns case analysis, you are likely going to lose the debate because you're just like giving them their entire app as offense. Okay. Final thoughts. This is just kind of the time that I've set aside for any questions. Um, okay. Uh, so in terms of like, isn't Manhattan an indigenous name? I'm not 100% sure if Manhattan is an indigenous name. And also, one sec, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Okay, cool. I'm leaving this time kind of open for questions. I'm not 100% sure if Manhattan specifically is an indigenous name, but yes, they did buy it from the French. I assume you're talking about the Louisiana Purchase. Oh, okay, yeah. So when to say the alt is conditional or unconditional, it's honestly like largely personal preference. So there are certain debates, like if you really want to avoid like a really annoying theory debate with someone who's going to be like, oh, must defend the alt as like, unconditional, like, and you're like, I really don't want to have that debate because there are some people who that's like their main strat against sec hall. I really don't know why, but like you can defend it as uncondo, but like ultimately, like it's your choice. It's stylistic. If you're confident in like having a condo good bad debate, because like let's face it, like conditional alt is really not that big of a deal. And yeah. Um and CX again, like before you should always specify if they ask you. Like you can't change your mind. If you're like in CX, oh, the alternative is condo, and then you're like, right before they give the one air. Actually, it's unconditional. You can't do that. Like you have to, cross-ex is binding. And obviously you could be like condo, oh, actually uncondo and cross-ex, but like that's like the only leeway you have. I would kind of know how you're defending it before you go into the debate. Um, Theory of power. The theory of power is just kind of like the overarching, like, what does this K say? What is the claim that the K is making? It is just this idea of like for example, the theory of power in settler colonialism is, um, oh, X, like, oh, X event happened that structures indigenous life in X way. That is like results in XYZ. And then the links are reasons as to why the AF makes that worse. Ontology, yeah. Chupang, you are right that it is the study of being, but in Sekol, it's not really like there is no social death claim that is being made. I mean, some people read a social death claim, but I really don't think that that's just like, I just, I just have a little bit of beef in terms of like when we're talking about structuralist critique and ontology, I just have a little bit of beef with like the way it's read in debate. When I say ontology, I would just it is the study of being. It's a claim about how indigenous being is structured. You are correct. Um, that's a good question. The K, this question says, do you think the K is not ontological, period, or just not static? Are there versions of the K that are more or less ontological? Um, I don't know if I would say there are versions of the K that are more or less ontological. I would say most Ks make the same claim, and people just refer to like a structuralist claim as ontology in debate, and I think that's fine, and I think you can keep calling it ontology. I do think that, settler colonialism implicates indigenous ontology in some way. I don't think it is a purely structured ontological critique in the same way that something like Afro-pessimism is so heavily reliant on ontology. Perms that are good to make, it depends on the app because I think sometimes, like, sometimes I would say that SQL just doesn't link to certain apps. Like, if you're reading, like, oh, wait, sorry. Wait, Chupong, what do you mean by a fill-off?
Like Kant or like Rawls or something like that.
I don't know enough about roles to tell you that, but I do know there's things like prim do both, prim do the aft, then the alt, an explanation as to why like roles can explain. You can leverage the roles as veil of ignorance stuff against that cult pretty easily, I think. And I don't really know what you mean, like what perms in general like do fill-offs make, because also like the alternatives that are read against fill-offs aren't usually like decol. They're usually something else.
What about some probably util ones? Like if I'm a LARPer and then I want to make some perms.
Just like the basic ones, perm do both, perm do the aft, then the alt, whatever. Just your normal responses to settler colonialism are fine. There is no perm, in my opinion, that is superior. I just think the mindset perm makes no sense. Other than that, I think like permutations in general are just very flexible arguments. And the thing that makes them strategic is when they are undercovered or discussed very poorly or responded to very poorly, just I think that's like you objectively know your AF better than any debater knows your AF. Um, so I just think it's probably easier for you to determine what perms work the best, what perms to go for in the tutor. In the KFV Suckle debate, how would you answer the K, specifically the links about performance using debate, etc.? Could you be a little bit more specific? What KF?
Okay, so like specifically in thinking about like more sort of high theory chaos, like Baudrillard, Bifo, um, offs like that, where people will like kind of read Sackle against that. How would you answer the sort of K in that particular case?
Okay, so same thing I just told Chupong. It depends entirely on what your literature is saying. If I was reading Foucault versus if I was reading Baudrillard, like the answers would be very different because both of those authors have very different claims on like what inequality is, what racism is, how they're at, like how that AF can be leveraged as offense versus Sekol is just entirely specific to the actual theory of the argument that you're reading. Wait, also, when you say links about performance using debate, etc., what does that mean? Like, I haven't seen a lot of performance links in terms of set call.
I mean, I know I was just sort of looking at like doing that sort of drill where you look at similar offs to yours, look at an NC that was read against it and attempt to do sort of a 1AR against it.
Mhm.
And there's like a specific link about sort of um it was a link, it was a performance link to Set Cole, and it was talking basically about like um
Are you talking about the Tuck and Yang indigenous storytelling thing?
mm, I don't think so because okay, wait, let me clarify. It was a
I
link about
can't
like
think like performance links to set call. I don't think alternative solve performance links to set call, if I'm going to be
okay, yeah.
honest, because performance is inevitable. So I don't know. I don't know about that. But I don't think that's the best link if you want to go for set call versus a KF. Set call on the wealth tax. What would a topic link look like if you ran set call on the wealth tax? This is a great question. Couple of things. So I actually was just talking about this with my mentee, and we talked about two things. So it's really similar to a living wage because it's a wealth redistribution topic, slash if the app has solvency, it should be a wealth redistribution topic. Um, and it's basically like, oh, we when we have wealth or when we tax wealth, we don't acknowledge that that wealth is built off the death of indigenous people and built off the theft of stolen land, built on the theft of stolen land. And I think a better link actually is the Wilmot evidence, super common on this topic. Essentially, it's a taxpayer's link. And it's like this idea that this is getting kind of very nitty gritty, but I really want to give you a good link. And I think this link is excellent. Essentially, what it says is it says that tax, like wealth tax or like tax policies, kind of have this dividing impact in which people now see themselves as like, oh, I'm a taxpayer. and this person is like an indigenous person who's like leeching off my taxes. It's very similar to this whole idea of like welfare queens. So what the Wilmot evidence talks about is it talks about how like taxpayers assume that they now have a right to govern indigenous people because they think indigenous people are benefiting off their taxes. That's not true for two reasons. One, indigenous people still have to pay federal income taxes despite the fact that they are like citizens of a tribal nation. And secondly, the tribal nation itself doesn't have to pay a tax as like a corporation would or like a church would, but the tribal nation does have to provide a comprehensive fiscal report to, I think, the BIA, a comprehensive fiscal report to the BIA, which tells them exactly what indigenous nations are doing with their money, shows them that indigenous nations actually do not have enough money and enough resources. But the government says because those institutions aren't paying corporate taxes, they don't have to give them any welfare, despite the fact that all of the citizens of those nations are paying corporate tax or paying federal income taxes, sorry. So, and when I say welfare queens, this is a very racist stereotype that developed, I think, around the 1980s, in which, you know, it's racist particularly towards Black women, in which Black women were painted as living off of government welfare. That's also how indigenous tribes are painted when in reality they don't receive government welfare, despite the fact that they are technically citizens of both the tribal nation and the United States, and they pay federal income taxes. So yeah, that was kind of a wordy explanation, but essentially the Wilmot link says taxation and wealth tax policies basically create this dichotomy between like the tax paying settler and the native that leeches off of those taxes, which is bad because one, it's not true, and two, it's racist and justifies white people always having control over indigenous lands. For Baudrillard, he makes a root cause claim about settler colonialism being caused by the violent need to make other cultures conform to European systems of knowledge. Would using that root cause claim as a sort of absolve/app controls internal link to solvency be a good one-air strategy on the ontology debate, or would other responses independent of the app work better? I think that's a great response, actually. I think that when you're leveraging your specific app against the critique, it makes it so much more persuasive and it makes it so much harder to answer because I promise you know more about Baudrillard than the debater who's reading set call on Baudrillard. So I do think that's a good example. I also think you should include other general answers because I think they're more likely to drop your AF specific example. And when they drop your AF specific example, you just sit on it in the 2AR for like 2 minutes and it's like game over. Yeah, of course. The steps of decolonization. Okay, this is a great question. Tuck and Yang says that like mapping out the steps to decolonization is settler colonialist because people are always going to say that those steps are impossible to take. And when we say that those steps are impossible to take and we think of other things as or other like crazy things as something that could be possible, but we somehow don't think of indigenous sovereignty as something that is possible, that is racist. And it's basically an excuse to keep putting settlers' desires at the forefront of our issues and indigenous desires on the back burner. So essentially what decolonization looks like, that's up to indigenous tribes. When you're reading Setcol as a non-indigenous person, your default answer should be like, one, I don't have a right to make that claim. Two, Tuck and Yang evidence specifically criticizes your need to know exactly what it looks like, and we think that's problematic. Yeah, of course.
All right, if there are no more questions, then I think everybody is free to leave, and I will be posting this lecture on our YouTube sometime today. So thank you for doing this, Salma. If you want to put your email in the chat in case anyone has any like last second questions, that'd be great. But thank you for doing this, and thank you to everybody who attended and asked questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. This was super fun. And thank you, Sophie, for hosting. You're the best.
Of course. Also, wait, you sent your email to me on a direct message.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Let me send it in the group chat. I had that. Oop. Okay, should be good.
Okay.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Oh, wait, someone asked if you could send the Cox 21 card in the Slack.
Yeah, of course. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.